Me again, Brandon, first 3 weeks. Um, so we're in this series, these first 3 weeks, talking about things that we as a community really value and sort of preaching through those things. Last week we talked about complete devotion to Jesus, and tonight we're going to talk about real friendship. And so I'm going to put you in small groups here in just a second, but I did want to comment because I've had some questions. Jessica announced our Focus First Year Leader program, and I know that there's a time on there. That was sort of an initial guess, and so I need you, if you're interested in that, but you can't do that Monday evening time, please fill out the thing. I will find a time or do it a second time for people. So we just have to kind of guess at when will work. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. In groups of 2 or 3, I don't want you to move too far, so it could be the same people that you just read with. I want you to share pretty briefly about whatever friend you've had in your life, whether past or present, who is most different from you. Tell a person about your friend that you've had that's most different from you. Go. Okay, start wrapping up. All right. I'm going to pull us back together. We'll have some more time to talk a little bit later. So this story that you guys read together, this story from Acts 10 of Peter and Cornelius, how many of you this story felt a little unfamiliar, like not one you've spent much time thinking about? It's not like a go-to for most people. I know that for me, for so long, I just sort of saw it as this like functional thing in the Bible. It's like, yes, at some point we had to realize that God loves Gentiles too. This is the point. But I think this story does so much more than that. I really do think it's the story of a budding spiritual friendship between these two men. And I think it does more than just one thing in this book, because one of the things that's so interesting about this story, we read it in Acts 10, but this story is actually told in pretty long form 3 times in the book of Acts. And you just kind of think like, what books do you read where it's like, and I'm going to tell you that story again. And in case you don't remember, I'm going to tell you that story again. That he tells this story 3 different times, and we get it the first time sort of told by the narrator, and then we get it 2 more times told by Peter himself, talking and explaining it to other people. And I think that gives us some clue as to how this story functions in the book. Because I think if we just take it the first time, it really becomes a story about Cornelius and how Cornelius was changed by getting to meet the Apostle Peter. It's Cornelius's conversion story, so to speak. But there's one other story that's told 3 times in long form in the book of Acts. And when you're reading the Bible and you start noticing interesting parallels and things like that, they're probably not accidental. They're probably on purpose. Does anyone know what the other story that's told 3 times in the book of Acts is? Any guesses? Yeah, in the book of Acts, yeah. Paul's conversion story. And we get the same thing. In fact, we get it 1 chapter away from this one. In Acts 9, we get Paul's conversion story. And Luke tells us that story. And then later on in the book, Paul tells that story again 2 more times. And so I think we're finding this interesting parallelism that this story of Cornelius and Peter is not just about Cornelius's conversion. I think it's also about a conversion for Peter of sorts. That Peter wasn't just taking the good news to this person, he was learning something about the good news himself, that he needed to be changed. And so we find this transformative friendship, because it's not just started by one person who knew God, being told to go preach to that heathen over there. That's not how the story went, is it? 2 different people heard directly from God in this story. 2 different people were sent to each other. And they were 2 men who knew God in really unique ways. But they crossed some powerful boundaries. This divide of Jew and Gentile in the ancient world, when you read Roman history and stuff, these were the groups that would have race riots between them in their world. These were groups that did not mix. And you even see that in the story, right? Peter says, it's against my law to even associate with you. And yet here in this story, we see them eating. I love the way the story ends, because it's like, and he stayed with them for a few days. It's like he just kind of moved in. This is the beginning of a friendship that's transformative for both of them, a friendship that's ordained by God. And a lot of us have probably undergone similar beginnings over the last week. I think that's a big part of the beginning of school, that there are some of us here who have been praying that we would make friends when we came to college this week or this semester. Some of you, even if you failed to pray, you had parents or grandparents or friends who were praying in your stead. And there were others here who, because someone did that for them, have been praying that they would meet people who needed friends, who were looking for friends. And so all of these friendships have started purposefully, ordained by God. But it's not just about some upperclassmen coming into the life of some underclassmen and transforming them. These friendships are going to be mutually transformational. That's God's plan. I remember a time, I'm not someone that, maybe this is bad on me, I don't know, but I don't have a lot of times in my life where I was like, the Lord spoke to me. But I do have a handful of those. And if maybe you're someone that the Lord speaks to, a lot, or maybe that's something that you think you really want, I have found that usually when he speaks to me very clearly, it's to get me to do something I don't want to do, or definitely would not have chosen to do on my own. After I had first finished college. I went to school here. I have 2 degrees from UTD, and had felt called to stay half-time working with Focus while I was also working in business and try to get the ministry kind of going. And so I remember this part of what was hard of that is the group that had really started Focus I was the youngest. And so by the time I was finishing grad school, all of my kind of core friend group had moved on and gone and done other things. And so I was in this place of praying for friends and just trying to figure out what does this look like to be this, 23-year-old in a group of 18 and 19-year-olds, and how's that gonna work? And so I'd been praying about that, and there was a guy in my ministry who I kind of had known. In fact, when I was in high school at a different church and stuff, this kid had been in my small group, but he was a few years younger than me, and he was such a punk. And he thought he was so cool. I remember running into him with a couple of my friends who were seniors, at the movies, and he's an 8th grader, and we tried to greet him in front of his friends, and he's like, "Who the F are you?" Acts like he didn't know us. I'm like, oh my gosh. And so this kid comes into my ministry, and he's a freshman, and he's still kind of a punk. But I do remember standing in a Galaxy room, it's one of those kind of profound moments, and I wasn't praying, I was just chatting, meeting people, and I looked across the room and just had this deep sense when I laid eyes on him that the Spirit was saying, "Be best friends with him." And I was like, "No, thank you." but it was a very profound moment to me. And I did build a deep friendship with him, a very complicated friendship with him. We're still very good friends to this day. He ended up being the second staff pastor for Focus here. I could tell many stories because he was still such a punk. He is the only person on our Focus staff that I have ever fired just on the spot. We were living together and sharing a bedroom at the time. So somehow we made that work. We had dinner the other night. He bought my dinner. It's really great, But it was a mutually transformative friendship. He was able to relate to a group of people that I had spent my high school years and then thus my college years sort of avoiding because they made me uncomfortable. I didn't know how to do that. We liked different things. We liked different people. And we were able to, sort of through the fussing and the arguing and the figuring it out to become more like Jesus. As we talked about last week, because we're devoted to Jesus, we're on a mission. We looked at the mission that he gave us. And we've said from the very beginning, this has never really changed, that our mission for Focus is to make and mature disciples for God's glory. To make and mature disciples for God's glory. And that's just really a reflection of the Great Commission, where Jesus says, I want you to go, I want you to make disciples, and then I want you to teach them, mature them, help them figure out what it looks like to obey all the things that I've commanded. And then the God's glory is just a reminder that we don't do that like the Tower of Babel to make a name for ourselves. All glory goes to him. But then the question becomes how? How do you do? That's great. That's a great goal, right? It came straight from the Bible, but how do you do that? And there's a lot of different possible answers to that in the culture and in the church and around. But I think our goal has been to look back at the master minister, the best one that ever came along, Jesus himself. Roger read to us from John 15. And you see in this scene where he's speaking to his disciples, he says, the scripture Roger read is, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. And he, just a few sentences later, he says, and I've called you my friends. Because a master doesn't share, his business with his servants. I've shared everything with you. I've told you everything that I've got. A little bit earlier, he says, you call me Lord and Master, and rightly so, because that's what I am. Then he says, but I'm calling you my friends. that Jesus invited these people into real friendship with him. I think back Mark 3, when Mark is recording the selecting of the 12, it says that Mark 3:13, I think, where Jesus goes up on this mountain by himself overnight, prays all night, and then he says that he chose 12 so that they could be with him and that he could send them out, that they could be with him. He picked these guys not just because, oh, these are the most talented. I'm going to pick some people that are going to spend time with me. Later on in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 4, those same 12 minus Judas are under arrest for speaking with Jesus or for preaching Jesus' name. And the Sanhedrin, it says that they took note that they were all unschooled, ordinary men, but that they'd been with Jesus. It's like the only thing that really stood out about these guys was who they had been hanging out with. That had been a transformative thing. And so we see from this and just reading the story of the Gospels as a whole that real friendship is the Master's method. And we don't need to improve upon it. We don't need to scale it up for him. We don't need to automate it like we like to do in America. You know, it's like, well, what if a computer could do it instead? What if a robot could do it instead? And we do this kind of stuff, right? Jesus taught in large groups, right? He did do some of this. It's not bad to teach in large groups if it's not a replacement for the kind of relational thing he was doing. Because when we get to the book of Acts, it's not the crowd from the Sermon on the Mount that shows up to do his will. It's those men and women that he hung out with, right? And they were along with him for all of those big lectures. They were a part of that. They remembered those things. They're the ones who recorded those things for us. But those big talks are not a substitute, and we've tried to kind of do that so often in church. It's like, well, what if we could just disciple 1,000 people at once? Wouldn't that be better? And I'm like, but we've missed the arrogance. It's like better than the way Jesus did it? That we think we can kind of scale his way up. Jesus was intensely relational. Not just in terms of long-term relationships, but even short-term. We see these encounters that he had with people that went deep, fast, and that decades later, people are like, I remember exactly what he said. I remember that conversation. That interaction stood out to me. That was unique. It was powerful. So Jesus' whole approach to ministry, community was intensely relational, but we, especially in America, we live increasingly fragmented, individualistic lives, right? By raise of hands, how many of you have never lived with anyone outside of your nuclear family? Right? Like, and some of us have, but you just see, like, do you realize how rare that would be in any other century and place? Right? We've got this idea, especially if you grew up here in America and maybe don't have recent immigrants in your family, that like this sort of 1940s and 50s ideal of the nuclear family living together and no one else, like that's somehow the norm. I'm like, it's not a norm. It's the weirdest thing that's happened in world history. It's happened this much of this big timeline. So it's an experiment. It's a luxury. We're going to start talking next week about an orphanage in West Africa that we as a community are trying to support. And one of the things I was talking to some of the missionaries that have run this, and they have 60 orphans that live in this house. And one of the things he said to me, he was like, okay, now don't think of like a huge building. He's like, think of like a small individual family's home and like kids just kind of, on blankets on the floor. There's 60. He's like, they're loved. People have brought them in, but these are poor people just trying to take care of people. See, we've got the luxury of we all have our own room and we all have our own house and we have our own space. And luxuries can be good, but we also know that too much of pretty much any luxury becomes bad for us, right? It's kind of like dessert. Dessert is a luxury, but if we just keep eating it and eating it and eating it, you end up looking like me. But we could do that with a lot of different things. And what we've found is as we've indulged ourselves in this luxury of privacy and space and kind of having my own area where no one infringes, is that it's been at the cost of intimacy. Real friendship is intimate. Real friendships are intimate. Our culture has forgotten often how to be intimate without being sexual. It's like that's kind of the only thing. It's like we almost just instantly associate the idea of intimacy with sexuality. But Jesus had intimate encounters with people. Think about Jesus washing his disciples' feet, right? And what he says to them when he does that is he says, unless you let me do this, you don't have any part with me. It's like, this is necessary. We've got to break down some of these things. You can't come to me all clean and perfect. I've got to be able to see the gritty part of you. So the next thing I want you to do in your small group is show them your feet. No, not really. Can you imagine? Okay. Please don't. Please don't. But you get my point, right? That real friendships are intimate, and we push past this stuff. I know for me, this is one of the things we're trying to do with Core. When I was going, to my early Bible studies and small groups, the Bible was kind of always out here, and we would talk about what people ought to do. And we're trying to do something that's more relational. We're sharing in each other's lives. We're sharing in each other's stories. We're hearing. But that requires that all of us take a little bit of risk, right? I compare speaking in Core to kind of like anteing up in a poker game. It's like, if I tell you some story even if it's an innocuous one, it's like I've kind of put something in the pot. We'll see. I might get something back, but I might lose something. There's a risk there. We've already talked about that real friendships are transformative, right? Proverbs 27:17 is one of, popular scripture. Just says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. But many have noted over time that when iron sharpens iron, sparks fly. And some of you have experienced that. When I was with Brad, my friend I was talking about earlier, a lot of sparks flew. And occasionally things would catch on fire. Yeah. But we were sharpened in that process because we were willing to stay in it. We see that with Peter and Cornelius. This is not a story of a comfortable beginning of a friendship. I mean, Peter, it wasn't enough for the Lord to give him a vision and tell him one time, right? I mean, do you see, it's like Luke kind of slips it in. He's like, and this happened 3 times, right? It's like he had to have 3 identical visions from the Lord before he's like, okay, I get it. I guess it's really what I'm supposed to do. They're being transformed. They're being changed. They're being pushed into each other's zones. Real friendships are purposeful and not just situational. And by that I mean we're not just sort of thrust together. We can start friendships by accident. We can start friendships situationally. But they will not last by accident. I can tell that over time. I've watched, I'm 45 years old. I have friends that date all the way back from middle school and high school, and I have a lot of people that were my friends that I hung out with that I'm like, what was that person's name again? Because there are people that purposed to stay in my life. They purposed to be friends. And so even when we lived on other sides of the country, traveled, did different things, we've on purpose stayed in each other's lives. And there are others that drift. I don't think that means that we didn't care about each other. Those were just, but they're not lasting friendships. They were friendships for a season. But the kind of friendships that are going to be lasting and meaningful over time are going to happen on purpose. And certainly, real friendships are selfless. That's what John records Jesus saying that Roger read to us. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. And do you hear the sort of radical thing, not just the self-sacrifice, but that Jesus, he doesn't say, greater love has no one than this, that a parent lay down their life for a child. Or greater love has no one than this, that a man lay down his life for his wife. He doesn't point to family as the place where the greatest love is found. He points to friendship. Because family is sort of by nature exclusive, but friendship is inclusive. I can be friends with my parents, and I am a friend with my wife, but I can't be married to all of you, right? Wrong religion. No. But Jesus saw friendship as the center. This is the highest thing to achieve, is that I learn to be a self-sacrificing friend. Someone who isn't in friendships just for what I can get out of them, how I can use those people to enjoy my life a little more. And maybe we mutually use each other and it's fun. But that I'm someone who's willing to give of myself, to be a friend even when it costs me something. The sad reality I've seen in nearly 30 years of ministry is that it is not hard to be most people's best friend. It's just not hard to be most people that you meet to be their best friend. I mean, if you just care about them a little bit and are willing to be a little bit sacrificial towards them, you're the best friend they've ever had. And I've seen that over and over again in our ministry. I remember one time one of the women, Corfas here, her name was Nikki, and she was telling me about this other girl, Laura, and we had been in core with Laura, like a co-ed core that we had, and she was telling me, she's like, Laura does not call me back. Laura just ignores me. She ignores my texts. She ignores my calls. It has been months. She's like, do I keep? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, like, because, you know, when someone just ignores you, you're like, am I just the biggest obnoxious person that they don't want to hear from ever? And so she's like, I don't know. And well, then I ran into Laura probably the next day or within the next couple days in the student union. And I was like, hey, how are you doing? And she's like, terrible. I just have been depressed and doing this. And she goes, the only person who checks on me is Nikki. She's the best friend I have. And I'm like, she goes, I haven't replied to her in 8 weeks. I was like, you should text her back. Like, that would be encouraging to her. But I mean, I ran back to Nikki and I was like, don't quit. Don't quit. She just told me you're her best friend. Because you're the one that will push past that kind of behavior and keep caring for her, even when she gives you nothing. Because Nikki did care for her. She did care what happened to her. It's not hard to be most people's best friend. So Jesus chose to do his ministry primarily in the context of friendship. And that's why we do too. That's why core is, we call it the core of our ministry. This is great, and we are doing specific things here that I think are really important. Core is not a great environment to root deeply in Scripture, as we're talking about here. Most cores don't have people that are qualified to teach and take you deeper. We're going to share each other's, if you've sat through very many small group discussions, you've heard as many really bad ideas as you have good ones, right? Because that's how the iron sharpens iron, and we're kind of like, oh, I don't know. Well, how'd you see that in that? I don't know. And, and we're more or less savvy at disagreeing with people. Like, I don't know. Yeah, okay. Um, but in that environment, friendships can really be built and blossom. It's why we spend time in one-on-one ministry. One of our little mottos as a ministry is one-on-one is how it's done. And that doesn't mean that everything has to literally be one person and one person. It's trying to capture this idea that Jesus' ministry was personal. It was personal to people. Whether those were one-on-ones that happened over and over again or a handful of people. I mean, Jesus seemed to spend a lot of extra time with Peter and James and John. And yet, even though we never really see a story where John is alone with Jesus, just one-on-one with Jesus, when John is writing his gospel, he always refers to himself as the disciple Jesus loved. Because he's like, the one thing I know about Jesus and me is that he loved me. So that's just kind of my name when I'm telling this story. Real friendship is the master's method, and we're not going to improve on it, and we're not going to try. And my prayer for you is that you would learn to be a friend like Jesus. That you would be like Cornelius and like Peter, who were both so in tune with God that they were ready to hear his voice when he said, I want you to be friends with this random guy, Peter, who stays at the tanner's house. No, Cornelius is like a rich person, and the tanners, that was like, they were basically like the sewer workers of that day. That was like such a stinky job that they had to do their thing out of town. And that's where Peter's staying. So he has that floating aroma on him, right? And God's like, I want you to go find this guy. He's a Jew. I know they don't normally talk to you. And I want you to find him. He's staying at, the sewer worker's house, and get him to come and stay with you. He's got something to tell you, right? And the same goes back with Peter, that you would be so in tune that you'd be ready when God points out that person across the room that you're like, my first answer is no, but all right, now I'll repent and go try and be friends with this person that you've called me to. But that's my prayer for you. And so what I want to do to wrap up is once you get back in your small groups or pairs or whatever, and I want you to just share, what is this sort of stirring up in you? What do you want to take from our time tonight, whether it was from the scriptures that you read or the things that I shared or something else that the Lord is doing, and then we'll worship together again. So